So, having dealt with the injury diagnosis, the outcome diagnosis, external circumstances, and individual circumstances, the next very important element of a narrative test assessment is this section 5, which deals with chronic pain, subjective suffering, and or loss of enjoyment of life. So why is that important? And the reason it's important is that the whole purpose of the RAF4 serious injury assessment is to determine whether somebody qualifies for general damages compensation. And the lawyers here will rapidly correct me if I'm wrong, but I've grown up in the medico-legal field to understand that the purpose of general damages, which are also called non-pecuniary damages, are compensation for the intangible and aspects which are difficult or impossible to count in monetary terms. And those are pain, suffering, loss of amenities, and loss of enjoyment of life. So those elements of general damage compensation, pain, let's start with pain, has got a major problem in terms of medico-legal assessment because, number one, it's subjective. Now, everything in the AMA guides, the impairment rating, relies on objective assessment. And because nobody can photograph your pain or measure it on a scale or apply any electrical device to you to determine how much pain you have, pain is a subjective experience of a human being. And as much as you can't determine it objectively, it is a very real problem. One of the problems associated with pain is that because it is subjective, it is also open to abuse. So, for example, people who don't want to work because they've hurt their back can exaggerate the extent of pain that they have. And it's difficult for a doctor or an assessor to determine how much pain they really have. So the assessment of pain is fraught with difficulty. But the fact that it's fraught with difficulty doesn't remove the importance of pain as a long-term consequence of injuries, particularly in that the purpose of general damages is to compensate for chronic pain. Now, there's another element of pain that is a problem, other than it being subjective, in that it is abstract. So what do I mean by abstract? That is as opposed to concrete. If you've got a below-knee amputation of the left leg, or you've got malunion of a femur fracture, which you can see on an X-ray, that is objectively determinable, and it is concretely measurable. Pain is both subjective and abstract. There are other impairments that are subjective and abstract. And that is, and I'm glad that Trevor Reynolds is going to be talking about that, those are the psychological consequences of injuries. Because you can't photograph or weigh or measure or detect another person's emotional suffering. The only way to determine it is to talk to the person. And luckily there are psychiatrists and there are psychologists who know how to do that. But it's very difficult because determination of emotional consequences of injuries is also to determine something abstract and something subjective. Certain elements of emotional disturbance can be concrete or observable. In other words, if a person is very anxious, the observer can see that they look anxious. So that element of it is objective. But how they feel is subjective, only they can say how they feel. When a person is depressed, the observer or the examiner can see that they look depressed. But only the person can say subjectively how they feel depressed or what it feels like to be depressed. So there's a major problem with the most important elements of general damages compensation, which deals with pain, suffering, loss of amenities, loss of enjoyment of life. Now, the loss of amenities is at least more objectively and concretely determinable. Like you always enjoyed playing rugby, now that you haven't got a foot, you can't play rugby. So that's a loss of amenities. That is objectively determinable. But there are other amenities which fall into the abstract or subjective field. But pain, suffering, loss of enjoyment of life all share the element of being both subjective and abstract. Now, the AMA Guides has got a very, very limited and poor capacity to measure subjective and or abstract impairments. The Guides recognizes that those impairments exist, and it makes certain attempts to measure them or to award percentage points to them. But I know the AMA Guides very well. I also know Professor Ranavaya very well, who come to South Africa often to train South African doctors on the use of the guides. And it is apparent in the text of the guides, and it's apparent in talking to Professor Ranavaya, that the AMA Guides does not have a scientific method of measuring abstract or subjective impairments. And it's not because there's anything wrong with the AMA Guides. It is because there is no scientific way to apply a percentage impairment rating to something that is subjective and that is abstract. Now, that brings about another very important reason for applying the narrative test. You will recall that the fundamental reason was because the AMA Guides cannot take circumstances into account. So the narrative test exists in order to take circumstances into account. But it is also essential in the narrative test to take into account the subjective and abstract impairments. And notwithstanding the fact that that is difficult and that it is subjective and abstract, it is very real and it is very disabling. So doctors, and in almost all cases, preferably supported by experts such as psychologists and therapists, should do their best, and this is a short description of how they should do it, to determine the veracity and the significance of the pain, subjective suffering, and loss of enjoyment of life. So that is the most difficult element of the narrative test. It is also the one that is most open to fabrication and exaggeration, and that is maybe one of the reasons why appeal tribunals have to exist, in order to evaluate not on a percentage basis, but on the basis of looking at context, symptoms, congruence, coherence, and rationality, whether this person suffers significant pain, suffering, or loss of enjoyment.